Sit up straighter. That's what the badge told her to do, and Vivian Marsh had never once been the kind of woman who needed telling twice. She was 60 feet from the security checkpoint at Lockwood Field International Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina, wheeling a scuffed leather carry-on that had crossed more state lines than most people's cars. She wore a plain navy trench, flats instead of heels, and a brass keychain shaped like a small biplane clipped to the outer pocket of her bag. The metal worn smooth in one spot where a thumb had rubbed it for 30 years. Her father had carried that same keychain on his belt loop every day he loaded luggage onto conveyor belts at this very airport, back when it was still called something else, back when nobody looked twice at a black man in coveralls hauling other people's suitcases into the dark belly of a plane. He never made it past ramp supervisor. He never asked to. He used to say the only thing that mattered was doing the job so clean, nobody could find a reason to say otherwise. Vivian had built an airline on that sentence. Meridian Sky Airlines was hers. Founder, chief executive, the name on the letterhead that regional carriers now measured themselves against. But nothing about her, standing in that line with her ordinary trench coat and her ordinary tiredness, announced any of it. That was deliberate. Twice a month she flew unannounced through one of Meridian's hub cities, bought her own economy ticket under a maiden name that wasn't flagged in any airline database, and rode in coach like anybody else, taking silent notes on how her staff treated people when no one important was supposed to be watching. Today's flight was Meridian 212 to Denver, ordinary Tuesday, ordinary line. The line at the checkpoint moved the way airport lines always move, a shuffling animal with 1,000 small irritations, parents wrangling toddlers out of strollers, a college kid in headphones, bouncing gently on his heels, an elderly man patting his blazer pockets 3 times to be sure his passport hadn't evaporated. Vivian stood with her boarding pass, folded once in her hand, and let the line carry her forward. She felt it before she understood it. A weight settling on the side of her face, the particular pressure of being looked at by someone who wasn't glancing but studying. She lifted her eyes just once. At the front of the checkpoint stood a screening officer in her late 30s, blonde hair scraped into a ponytail so tight it looked painful, arms folded across a stiff gray uniform. Her name tag read D. Halverson. She was not scanning the crowd the way the other 2 officers were. She was watching one woman in a navy trench coat, and she had been watching her for the better part of a minute. Vivian looked back down at her boarding pass. She did not need to look up again to know the feeling would still be there when she did. Before we go any further, because you will want to know how this ends, and I promise you the ending is worth every minute it takes to get there. I want you to notice the little brass airplane clipped to that bag. Remember it. It comes back. The closer Vivian moved to the front of the line, the more deliberately Officer Halverson arranged her face into something like boredom for every other passenger who approached, only to let it fall away, flat and fixed, the instant her eyes returned to the woman in navy. When it was finally Vivian's turn, Halverson didn't reach for the boarding pass the way she'd reached for the last 6. She planted her feet first, like someone bracing for a door that might swing back at her. "ID and boarding pass," she said, pleasant enough in pitch, nothing pleasant underneath it. Vivian handed both over without a flicker of hesitation. Her hands were steady. Her eyes stayed level with the officers, and she did not blink first. Halverson studied the documents far longer than the documents required. Her gaze moved from the photo to Vivian's face, back to the photo, back to the face. The way you'd check a signature you already suspected was forged. "This you?" she asked. "Yes," Vivian said. "Traveling alone?" "Yes." Another pause. Too long. Too obvious to be procedure, and both of them knew it. "Step aside," Halverson said finally, sliding the documents into a plastic tray instead of handing them back. "We're going to need a secondary screening." Vivian didn't argue. She had watched this exact scene play out 100 times before, in 100 different airports. Never to her, always to someone who looked like her. And she had promised herself long ago that if it ever came for her directly, she would not give anyone the performance they were hoping for. She stepped aside. Behind her, a father maneuvered a stroller around the gap she'd left. A young woman slid a laptop into a gray bin without glancing over. Nothing loud had happened. Nothing ever does in these moments. That's what makes them so easy to get away with. Halverson snapped on a pair of blue gloves with a crack that seemed to echo louder than it should have. She motioned Vivian toward a stainless inspection table, set just off to the side of the main flow, where the empty plastic bins sat waiting like open mouths. "Let's have a look at that bag," Halverson said. Vivian set it down herself and unzipped it herself, because she had learned that offering your own hands kept a small measure of the moment in your possession. Folded blouses, a paperback, a slim leather folder, stamped with Meridian Sky's winged compass seal, containing nothing more dangerous than route performance reports and a stack of employee evaluation forms, and clipped to the outside pocket, catching the fluorescent light, for just a second, the small worn brasses airplane. Halverson's gloved hand went straight for the folder first. Not the phone, not the wallet, the folder, as if she'd already decided what she was looking for before she opened the bag. She flipped it open, saw the winged compass seal, and her eyebrows lifted in something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite respect either. "You work for Meridian?" she asked, in a tone that made the question sound like an accusation. "Yes," Vivian said. "Doing what?" "Operations review." "What's that mean, exactly?" It wasn't curiosity. It was a challenge dressed up as a question, the kind people ask when they've already decided the answer won't satisfy them. "It means I check whether the airline is doing what it says it does," Vivian said, and kept her voice as flat and unremarkable as the tile floor beneath her flats. Halverson shoved the folder back into the bag without care, the corner of a document form, bending under the force of it, and moved on to unrolling a blouse, checking the seams of the coat, running a thumb along the lining as if Vivian might have stitched something illegal into a cashmere hem. A second officer, younger, mid-20s, a clipboard hanging loosely from one hand, like he hadn't yet decided how much of the uniform's authority actually belonged to him, hovered near the edge of the table and said nothing. "Only bag?" Halverson asked. "Yes." "No checked luggage?" "No." She picked the driver's license back up and turned it in the light for the third time. "This looks new," she said. "It's within its issue date," Vivian said. "Nothing about it is irregular. You don't exactly look like someone who'd be carrying this kind of clearance level," Halverson muttered. Not quite under her breath, not quite loud enough to be undeniable, but loud enough that the younger officer's eyes flicked sideways in visible discomfort. Something moved behind Vivian's eyes for exactly half a second. Nothing else about her changed. Not her hands, not her spine, not her breath. If you were only half watching, you would have missed it entirely, and that half second is exactly where this story lives. Halverson wasn't finished. She pulled the phone from the outer pocket next, turned it over in her gloved hand like it might be something other than what it obviously was, and thumbed the screen awake without asking. "Mind unlocking this?" "That's not standard procedure for a cleared traveler," Vivian said evenly. "It is when I say it is." Halverson set the phone down harder than the moment required, the small clatter of it against the steel table drawing a flinch from the younger officer standing nearby. "Shh." She moved next to the coat, running her fingers along the collar seam, checking the cuffs, patting down a hem that had never once concealed anything more dangerous than a dry cleaning tag. Then she picked the ID back up a fourth time, tilting it under the fluorescent light, as though one more look might finally produce the answer the first three hadn't. "Where'd you say you were flying to?" "Denver," Vivian said, It's printed on the boarding pass in your hand. I'm asking you, Denver, for what purpose? Business. What kind of business exactly requires flying alone, economy class, with a folder full of airline paperwork? The question hung there, dressed up as procedure, carrying nothing procedural inside it at all. Around them, the line had thinned to a trickle, and the trickle had started, in the particular way crowds do, to slow down and watch without appearing to watch. A woman in scrubs paused at the far end of the conveyor, phone half raised, then lowered it again, unsure. An older man adjusted his glasses and looked away. The specific kind of looking away that comes from people who have decided that whatever is happening is none of their business, even when some quiet part of them suspects otherwise. That reluctance to look, that quick retreat into somewhere else, into a shoelace, a boarding pass, a spot on the floor, is its own kind of answer. It always has been. The wand came out only after all of that, and only after Halverson had gone through the bag a second time, checking the same zippered pocket twice, as though something might have grown there between the first search and the second. 2 lanes over, a woman named Naomi Reed, 28 years old, 400,000 followers who mostly wanted her opinions on eyeliner and airport outfits, had already lifted her phone and started filming, angled low and wide so it wouldn't be obvious. She didn't know who the woman at the table was. She didn't need to. She had seen this particular shape of scene enough times to recognize it on instinct. A black woman standing motionless while a stranger in a uniform went through her belongings looking for a crime that didn't exist. The scanning wand came out next. Run over sleeves, wrists, the inside of a palm. No alarm. No beep, no reason at all, and everyone within 10 feet of that table understood it, including Halverson. "You're clear," she said at last, peeling off the gloves and dropping them in a trash bin without meeting Vivian's eyes. She turned her back before Vivian had even finished zipping the bag. No apology, no explanation. The younger officer mumbled something that might have been, "Have a good flight," and was swallowed almost entirely by the noise of the terminal. Vivian slid her feet back into her flats, with the same unhurried precision she'd used to take them off, clipped the little brass airplane back into place, and walked toward her gate without once looking back. Behind her, Naomi watched the line of that walk. Shoulders level, spine long, a stride that refused to hurry, and something about it stayed with her long after the woman had disappeared into the crowd. She looked down at the minute of footage on her screen. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. She hit save. There was one more witness that morning, though nobody would think to mention her for weeks. An older woman waiting 2 lanes over, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Delaney flying to see her grandson graduate from basic training, had watched the whole exchange without lifting her phone at all. She didn't have the nerve for that, she would say later, and she wasn't ashamed to admit it. 31 years in a public school system had taught her exactly how much trouble a person could invite by being the one who spoke up first. But as Vivian passed her on the way to retrieve her shoes, Ruth reached out, just for a second, and rested 2 fingers lightly on Vivian's forearm. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Vivian nodded once and kept walking, and something about that small, wordless wait stayed with her longer than the wand or the gloves ever would. The younger officer, the one with the clipboard, would remember that morning differently than either of them. His name was Tyler Grant, 26 years old, 4 months into the job, and he had felt the wrongness of it the entire time without once finding a way to say so out loud. He told himself, walking back to the break room afterward, that it wasn't his place to correct a senior officer in front of a line of passengers, that he'd raise it privately later, that there would be a better moment. There never was a better moment. There rarely is, for people who wait for one. Vivian reached her gate with 11 minutes to spare, opened the Meridian folder on her lap, and wrote a single word at the top of a blank evaluation page in block letters. Skific. She closed the folder, looked out at the tarmac, and said nothing at all. But somewhere behind that stillness, a decision had already been made. And it was not a small one. To understand why that half-second mattered so much, you have to go back 19 years, to a glass-walled interview room on the 9th floor of a logistics firm in Atlanta, where a 26-year-old named Vivian Marsh sat with her hands folded on a resume that was polished but not yet powerful. Across from her, an executive barely glanced at her file before asking why someone with her background thought she was ready to run national freight logistics for a mid-size carrier. She hadn't raised her voice. She had listed, calmly, every route she'd optimized as an unpaid intern, every vendor contract she'd renegotiated under budget, every crisis she'd rerouted at 2 in the morning without waking a single supervisor to ask permission. They hired her the next day, but she carried something out of that room that never left her. The understanding that in rooms like that one, outrage was a currency she could not afford to spend, no matter how legitimately she'd earned it. Composure was armor. Silence, chosen on purpose, was a kind of power too, the only kind available to her at the time. Her father had died the year before Meridian Sky's first plane left the ground, never seeing what the keychain in his coverall pocket would eventually become. He used to tell her, sitting on the back steps of their house in a Charlotte neighborhood, where half the men on the block worked the same ramp crews he did, that the day would come when nobody would be able to look at her sideways and get away with it. She hadn't fully believed him. Today, sitting in seat 21C of her own airline's aircraft, with a folder full of routine notes on her lap and one word, Versiki, burning at the top of the page, she thought about that back porch a great deal. She thought, too, about the fact that this was the first time in 19 years of careful, deliberate anonymity that the sting had reached all the way down to something old. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. Degrees, boardrooms, a company with her name on 400 aircraft tails, and she could still be pulled out of a line like contraband on a Tuesday morning by a woman who'd had decided, in under 4 seconds, exactly what kind of person she was looking at. If you think that flight to Denver was the end of it, you are about to learn something about Vivian Marsh that Officer Denise Halverson did not know yet, and would come to regret not knowing at all. Denise Halverson had worked airport security for 11 years and had never once, in her own mind, done anything wrong. She believed, genuinely, in the particular way that made her dangerous, that she had a gift for reading people, an instinct honed by experience that the department's official protocols were too soft to fully capture. Clearance systems could be spoofed, she told herself. IDs could be printed. Her eyes could not be fooled the way a scanner could. She had built an entire private mythology around this idea, one override at a time, one flagged traveler at a time, and nobody above her had ever told her to stop, because nobody above her had ever been made to look closely enough at the pattern. That pattern existed. It existed in a server. Nobody at her level was supposed to be able to see, logged automatically every time an officer manually overrode an automated clearance. Over 2 years, Denise Halverson had triggered 41 such overrides. 36 of them involved women who were Black or Latina, traveling without a companion. Not one had ever resulted in a confiscated item, a criminal charge, or so much as a raised voice from the passenger. Every override carried a note field, and in that note field, again and again, in her own clipped handwriting, sat some version of the same 4 words: visual concern, behavior inconsistent. She had no idea that file existed in a form anyone could ever pull. She had no idea that the events of that Tuesday morning would be the thing that finally pulled it. Naomi Reed's minute of quiet footage sat untouched on her phone for 6 days before she finally posted it, almost as an afterthought, captioned only with a single line: "I don't know who this woman is, but I know exactly what I watched." The clip did not go viral in the way loud things go viral. It spread the way something true spreads. Slowly, then all at once, forwarded. Not because it was dramatic, but because thousands of people recognized the shape of it instantly. The particular quiet of a woman standing still while a stranger decided she was guilty of something that didn't have a name. It reached Meridian Sky's internal social monitoring team on a Thursday afternoon. It reached Vivian's chief of staff, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Nathaniel Cole, 40 minutes after that. And it reached Vivian herself at 6:12 that evening, forwarded with a single line from Nathaniel. "I think this might be you. Watch the coat." She watched 11 seconds of herself, standing at a stainless table, while gloved hands moved through her belongings, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in the terminal itself. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific, exhausted recognition of watching, from the outside, a thing you'd already lived through once from the inside. She did not call a press office. She called her niece. Emma Marsh was 24. Sharp-tongued in the way only people who love you fiercely are allowed to be, and had spent the last 2 years building a small but serious reputation as a civil rights researcher. The kind who filed public records requests for sport and read federal oversight reports the way other people read novels. When Vivian told her what had happened at the checkpoint, Emma didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "Give me 48 hours." What Emma found in those 48 hours did not come from a whistleblower in a trench coat meeting her in a parking garage. It came from a public accountability request Emma had filed 8 months earlier for an entirely unrelated story. One that had quietly finished processing and landed in her inbox at almost exactly the moment she needed it most. A coincidence so precise it felt engineered. Though it was, in the end, only the slow gears of bureaucracy finally turning at the right time. Buried in 400 pages of redacted screening logs was a single line that made her sit up straight in her chair at 11 at night. Override initiated by Officer D. Halverson, Lockwood Field, Terminal C, 0741, Reason Code 04, Visual Concern, 41 override entries, 36 with the same demographic pattern. Not one with a documented safety justification that held up under review. This is the part of the story where you might expect a dramatic confrontation. Someone slamming a folder onto a desk, a shouting match in a hallway. It didn't happen that way, and that restraint is exactly what made what came next so much harder for anyone to walk back. Vivian did not go to the press. She went to the Federal Aviation Oversight Board that regulated screening contractors at every airport Meridian Sky flew into, and she brought with her not outrage, but documentation. The override log, Naomi's 11 seconds of footage, and a formal request that the pattern be reviewed under the board's own existing misconduct statute, the same statute that had sat unused on a shelf for years, because nobody with enough standing had ever bothered to invoke it. On behalf of someone the system had already decided didn't matter enough to check. The Oversight Board could not ignore a filing from the chief executive of a carrier that moved 11 million passengers a year through their jurisdiction. Within 9 days, a formal review was opened. Within 16, Denise Halverson was placed on administrative leave pending a hearing, and the moment that notice was read aloud to her in a small windowless office at Lockwood Field, she said the same 6 words she would keep saying for the next 2 months, to anyone who would listen. "I was just doing my job." She said it to her supervisor. She said it to the union representative assigned to her case. She said it, eventually, into a federal hearing room, full of people holding 400 pages of evidence that told a very different story than the one she had told herself for 11 years. Before any of that reached a hearing room, Naomi Reed asked for 10 minutes of Vivian's time, and Vivian gave her 40. They sat across from each other in a quiet conference room at Meridian's headquarters. No ring lights, no backdrop, just 2 chairs and a phone propped on a stack of books, recording audio for a follow-up post Naomi had promised her followers. Naomi asked about the checkpoint first, the facts, the sequence of it, and Vivian answered the way she answered everything, in the same level tone she used in board meetings. But when the question turned toward what it had felt like, something in her posture loosened by a degree that a stranger might not have noticed, and that Emma, watching from the doorway, noticed immediately. I spent 19 years believing that if I never gave anyone a reason, they'd eventually stop looking for one, Vivian said. What I learned standing at that table is that the reason was never about anything I did. It was decided before I said a single word. She paused, and let the pause sit there the way she'd learned to let pauses sit, not for effect, but because some sentences need room to land properly. People ask why we stay so calm in moments like that. The truth is, a lot of us were raised to believe composure was the only kind of safety we were allowed to have. I believed that for a very long time. I'm not sure I believe it anymore. What changed? Naomi asked quietly. I found out I wasn't the first, Vivian said, and I have a platform most of the other 36 women never had. If I stay quiet now, I'm not protecting anyone. I'm just proving her right. When the recording stopped, Naomi didn't reach for her phone or her notes. She reached for Vivian's hand instead, held it for a moment, and said nothing at all, and Vivian, who had spent 19 years perfecting the art of not needing anyone to say anything, let her. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but the room filled long before that. Rows of wood-paneled seating occupied by agency officials, civil liberties observers, a union representative, and a small, carefully limited press pool. Denise Halverson sat at the center of it, all in her department blazer, buttoned too tight, her hands folded so hard in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. She did not make eye contact with anyone. Across from her, a panel of 3 senior officials arranged binders thick with redacted logs, screening timestamps and complaint histories that had been quietly filed away and marked resolved for years, without anyone ever connecting them into a single shape. We are convened today, the lead panelist said, to review the conduct of Officer Denise Halverson relative to a documented override on Meridian Sky Flight 212, and a broader pattern established across a 2-year period. They started with the timestamps. Vivian's identification had cleared the automated system in under 3 seconds. Halverson's manual override had been entered less than 1 second after that clearance appeared on screen, meaning the system had already told her everything was fine before she'd decided, on her own authority, that it wasn't. A recording of her radio call to the second officer that morning was read into the record. This one doesn't look right to me. Something's off about the ID. The ID everyone in the room already knew was accurate down to the last digit. Then came the pattern. Case after case laid out across a projector screen. Each one a woman flagged for reasons that dissolved the moment you looked at them directly. One had been detained with an infant in her arms for 22 minutes. Another had been questioned about the balance in her own checking account, as though a boarding pass required proof of wealth. Third had had her documents returned to her thrown, not handed, across a table, with no explanation offered at all. Every one of those complaints had been logged. Every one had been marked inconclusive, insufficient documentation, addressed informally. Not one had ever reached a hearing room until a woman with a Fortune 500 letterhead had walked one there herself. When the panel finally turned to Halverson and asked her to respond, she straightened her collar, and her voice, when it came, was firm, but no longer confident. I followed protocol, she said. Every one of those overrides was made in the interest of public safety. A panelist leaned forward, unhurried, the way people lean forward when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. Explain to this board, she said, how public safety required overriding a federal clearance system that had already confirmed the traveler's identity in under 3 seconds, 36 separate times, against the same narrow demographic, with 0 resulting confiscations, 0 criminal referrals, and 0 documented threats. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Nobody in that room moved. The fluorescent lights hummed the way they always had, indifferent to what they were illuminating. Halverson opened her mouth once, closed it, and said nothing at all. And for the first time in 11 years, the room did not let her get away with that either. "I want it on the record," she finally said, "that I believe I was protecting people. I still believe that." That sentence is the one that ended her career, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. True to who she genuinely was. A woman who had built her entire sense of competence on an instinct she had never once been asked to examine, and who, even now, standing in the wreckage of the pattern that instinct had produced, could not bring herself to call it what it was. The panel's ruling came 4 weeks later. Termination, effective immediately, with a formal finding of documented misconduct entered into her federal employment record. A record that would follow her into any future position, requiring public trust for the rest of her working life. The union did not appeal. There was, in the end, nothing left to appeal. But the story did not end with one officer walking out of a federal building, carrying a cardboard box of desk items. It ended, if it ends anywhere, with what came after, because Vivian Marsh had never once wanted a single firing. She wanted the shelf the complaints had been sitting on for years to be torn down entirely, and she used the only leverage she had ever fully trusted. Her own name, spoken clearly in a room full of people who could no longer pretend not to be listening. 3 months after the hearing, the same oversight board that had reviewed Halverson's case convened an industry-wide summit on passenger screening standards, and Vivian Marsh was asked to speak. The auditorium in downtown Charlotte was full an hour before the program began. Airline executives, federal officials, journalists, advocacy groups who had spent years filing the same kinds of complaints that used to disappear into filing cabinets marked resolve. When she walked onto that stage, in the same understated navy she'd worn at the checkpoint months before, the room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet, for people they've decided actually matter. She did not open with her own story. She opened with a name. 36 women, she said, were flagged by one officer over 2 years, using language that never once matched anything a scanner detected. I am the 37th. The only difference between us is that I own an airline, and that difference is exactly the problem I'm here to talk about. She paused, letting that land the way she'd learned years ago that a well-placed silence could do more work than a raised voice ever could. My experience wasn't unusual. It was simply visible. For every woman whose name made it into a hearing room, there are dozens whose complaints were logged, marked inconclusive, and forgotten. That has to change. Not because it happened to me, but because it happened to them first, and nobody was listening. She called plainly for a federal called mandate requiring transparent override reporting at every screening checkpoint in the country, independent review of any pattern crossing a defined demographic threshold, and mandatory reinstatement review for every complaint that had been closed without a hearing in the last 5 years. It was not a speech built for applause lines. It got them anyway, a wave of it, sustained, the kind that comes from people recognizing that something structural has actually shifted rather than merely been apologized for. Outside the auditorium afterward, Emma was waiting by the curb, arms crossed, trying and failing to look like she hadn't been crying a little during the final minute of the speech. "They didn't just hear you," Emma said, squeezing her aunt's hand. "They felt it. We did this together," Vivian said. "This is yours too." 6 months after the hearing, the federal mandate Vivian had called for passed with bipartisan support. Neither of them had expected to see move that quickly. 14 additional complaints against other officers at other airports all previously closed as inconclusive, were reopened under the new review standard. 3 resulted in termination. 1 resulted in a formal apology, printed and mailed, to a woman who had been detained with her infant for 22 minutes on a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, and had never once been told she had a right to file anything beyond the form nobody read. Denise Halverson, for her part, never did find the sentence she needed to say. Months later, in a brief statement to a local reporter who caught her outside a grocery store, she said only that she had made decisions based on the information available at the time. A sentence built entirely out of the same architecture that had gotten her fired in the first place, still standing, still certain, in a life that had otherwise come apart around her. Vivian Marsh kept the brass airplane clipped to her carry-on. She still flies twice a month under a name that isn't flagged anywhere, still rides in coach, still watches how her staff treats people who look like they might not be worth a second glance. But now, when she reaches a checkpoint, there's a small laminated card clipped beside the little brass plane. A passenger rights notice, the first of its kind, printed at every federally regulated checkpoint in the country, listing in plain language exactly what a traveler is owed and exactly who to call if they don't receive it. She didn't design the card. She just made sure, finally, that it existed. On the evening the new standard officially took effect, Vivian stood at her office window on the 14th floor of Meridian Sky's headquarters, watching the last gold light fall over a runway she had walked as a child, holding her father's hand, watching him load suitcases into the dark hold of a plane that would never once know his name. She turned the little brass airplane over once between her fingers, the way she'd done 10,000 times before, and set it down gently on the windowsill. Not put away, just resting, the way you set down something that has finally finished the job it was carrying. Outside, the tarmac lights blinked on, one by one against the coming dark, steady and unhurried, the way they always had, the way they always would, except that now, somewhere down in that terminal, a woman traveling alone would go through the same line Vivian once stood in, and for the first time in a very long time, nobody would decide who she was before she'd said a single word.